China's leader Xi Jinping broke precedent to take on a third term as the country's president on October 30th. With the start of his new term, Xi has a new slate of top leadership and renewed attention on Taiwan. Bradley Bowman is Senior Director of the Center on Military and Political Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Brad, welcome.
Well, thank you very much.
You know, some analysts are saying that Xi's new leadership appointments indicate a strategic shift from economic prosperity to technological and military dominance. Do you think that's the direction China's going?
I do think that's the direction that China is going. I think they've been going that direction for a while now. What may be somewhat new here is just the speed with which they're progressing that direction and the explicit nature of what they're doing. In some ways, Xi's extraordinary third term that he's now obtained is both a serious problem and a blessing for the United States. It's a serious problem, I'd say, because they've explicitly refused to rule out the use of military force against Taiwan to establish authoritarian control over of the free people on that island. So that's a major problem and is fundamentally destabilizing, as the Biden administration has said. That's the bad news. The good news, from an American perspective, I would say, is that they're not hiding their cards anymore. You know, there long was kind of an approach in Beijing where they wanted to kind of hide their strength and bide time. Well, those days are long gone now, both in their words and their actions. It's clear from my vantage point, what Beijing means what they say. And that's the essence of a threat. When someone has the intent and they're building the capability, that's a powerful combination that we have to take seriously. And so I think following Xi's establishment of his new third term, we have to assume that a military aggression in Taiwan is more likely than ever, and it could happen sooner than we want.
I do want to ask you about Taiwan, but first I want to ask you about space, because recently the Defense Department named China's space activity a threat in that latest national defense strategy. What do you see as the threat China's space program poses to the U.S.?
You know, it's a great question. I'm glad you're asking it because, as many of your viewers will know, space is more important than ever to not only our economy and our quality of life, but to our security and to our military operations. You know, we depend on space for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. We depend on space for missile defense warning. We depend on it for command, control, and communications, and increasingly even for conventional military operations in other domains back here within the atmosphere. So we know that, Beijing knows that. And we essentially have I don't think it's hyperbole to say is some form of a space race going on with Beijing. They're certainly racing, and we appear to be waking up and racing ourselves. And when you look at the testimony earlier this year of the leaders of the U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Space Force, you know, the testimony there is, I'd say, a bit of a wake-up call for many Americans who may not be paying full attention to this. They said, quote, "The PRC is researching, developing, fielding the space and counter space systems needed to defeat the joint force." So they're integrating their capabilities to use space to target maritime, air, and land forces and project power through space. So, I mean, that's pretty, you know, for as far as DC testimony documents go, that's not pulling any punches. And so if you look at the news just in the last few days regarding the new Chinese space station, right? A lot of that, you know, hey, learning how to grow seeds and operate in cold environments, that's great. You know, exploration of space, wonderful. But we know from America's history in space is that there are significant military advantages to having capabilities in space. And it's almost impossible to extricate the two in terms of commercial interests and national security interests. And so, in short, China is building the capability to seize the high ground and to take away our ability to rely on space in a contingency, and while simultaneously trying to constrain our efforts to protect our interests in space. And that should be a deep concern for anyone paying attention.
And Brad, I do want to go back to Taiwan, because in a recent speech, she talked about the importance of reunifying China and Taiwan, but he didn't give a timeline. So is this a renewed push for reunification, or is he just being more open about it?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think they're being more explicit than ever. This is, of course, a long-standing goal, right? From an American perspective, though, our attitude is codified in the Taiwan Relations Act and memos and other communiques, is that we think the conflict should be resolved peacefully and not by force. And Beijing is refusing to take force off the table, and that's fundamentally destabilizing. And we saw the massive military exercises after Speaker Pelosi's visit. And so the question for the United States is, do we know exactly when is it going to happen? Is it next year? Is it 5 years from now? No one knows for sure, but I would suspect that Xi's under tremendous pressure to try to quote unquote resolve this crisis before the end of his third term. So that means 5 years. I mean, do the math, 2022, 2027. And that is in harmony with much of the testimony we're getting from the Department of Defense. Bottom line is we don't know for sure. And what we do now will affect whether that is delayed or whether it ever happens. And as we've learned from Ukraine, deterring conflict is a heck of a lot less expensive than dealing with something that you could have avoided in the first place.
And very briefly, Brad, American and Chinese officials are working to set up an in-person meeting between Presidents Biden and Xi. What would you expect to come out of that meeting?
Meetings depend on the personalities and goals of the leaders, but I think more than anything, they often reflect the power balances between the two countries. And when I look at the actions of the United States, I see a growing and concerning gap between Washington's words and actions. We are not nearly as prepared for deterring and defeating aggression in the Taiwan Strait as Washington suggests and as many Americans believe. And there's steps we need to be taking now to prevent that conflict. And should it come, God forbid, that our service members can be successful and return home to their families.
All right, Brad, thanks so much for being on the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on any future Government Matters interviews.